They used to laugh when you said it. They called you dramatic, paranoid, delusional. They thought your warnings were nothing more than noise, a cry for attention. But you weren't speaking from fear. You were speaking from observation. You noticed the cracks they ignored. You caught the subtle shifts, the way people moved, the way systems bent, the way truth whispered in silence long before it shouted in chaos. They mistook your awareness for madness. Now the very thing they mocked is plastered on their screens, reported by the same mouths that once told you to quiet down. That is the curse and the beauty of vision. You see it before they can, and by the time they catch up, it's no longer prediction, it's reality. The secret was never in magic or luck. It was in your refusal to be distracted by surface illusions. Most people see what they want to see, not what is actually happening. You stripped away the comfort of illusions and forced yourself to study the patterns that others avoided. People live in denial because denial is easier than facing truth. You didn't give yourself that luxury. You allowed discomfort to become your compass, and discomfort always points toward change. That's why your words sounded crazy to them. You were willing to say what they were too scared to think. They laughed because laughter is the shield of the unprepared. When you told them where things were headed, they mocked to protect their fragile sense of control. They couldn't admit you were right, because that would mean admitting they were blind. People will fight harder to protect their pride than they ever will to protect their future. You didn't need their belief. You needed your own clarity. While they wasted energy debating your sanity, you invested energy in preparing for the storm you knew was coming. That's the difference between a fool and a visionary. You weren't chasing applause. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't trying to look clever. You were simply reading what was already there, etched into the behaviors, the decisions, the choices people kept making without realizing the consequences. It takes a sharp eye to see how small choices add up to inevitable collapse. That's where psychology becomes your weapon. Human beings repeat patterns, even as they swear they've changed. You saw the pattern, and the pattern told the story. That is why you knew. They wanted to believe chaos was random. You knew chaos is designed by neglect. Every broken system collapses not by surprise, but by repeated ignorance. Every failed relationship ends not in one explosion, but in 1,000 small betrayals that no one wanted to admit were happening. Every downfall looks sudden only to those who refuse to pay attention. You paid attention. You saw what they could not because you didn't look away. You let the truth sit, raw and unpolished, until it revealed the ending they didn't want to believe in. The funny part is they will now pretend they knew it all along. They will rewrite the story, placing themselves as wise observers who saw it coming. Once the evidence is undeniable, that's human nature. No one wants to admit they were blind. No one wants to say they ignored the signs. But you remember who doubted, who mocked, who dismissed your words as nonsense. You remember their faces. And while they rewrite their history, your truth needs no edits. It stands on its own, unshaken, because reality doesn't require permission to exist. The power of prediction isn't supernatural. It's rooted in patience. You didn't rush to convince them. You didn't try to force them to see what they weren't ready for. You simply waited. Because visionaries know that truth doesn't need to be argued, it just needs time. Time exposes everything. Time humbles everyone. And now, as your so-called crazy prediction floods every headline, they are forced to confront the fact that your patience outlived their disbelief. What makes your prediction terrifying to them is not just that it came true. It's that it reveals how blind they really were. It forces them to admit they trusted appearances instead of substance. They trusted noise instead of silence. They trusted ease instead of effort. And now, they scramble to understand how you knew when they didn't. They'll ask questions not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. They want the formula. They want the certainty you had. But the formula was never hidden. The problem was they never wanted to face it. You knew because you trained your mind to sit in stillness. You trained your eyes to look where others looked away. You trained your soul to accept the discomfort of seeing truth before it's convenient. That's the cost of awareness. It isolates you. It makes you the outcast until the moment you're proven right. And then, the same people who mocked you look at you with fear, because if you were right once, what else might you be right about? That fear is respect disguised as doubt. Gaslighters are creatures of repetition. They believe they're unpredictable because they twist stories, deny obvious truths, and distort memories. But once you see beneath their performance, you realize their script never changes. Every lie they tell, every trick they pull, is an armor built to hide the same wound, shame. That's why they are easy to predict. Their chaos is only a disguise, and like all disguises, it can only cover what they fear most. You watched carefully, and the pattern revealed itself. Whenever the truth got close to exposing their weakness, they created a smokescreen. Whenever you struck a nerve, they redirected blame. Their lies weren't random. Their lies were maps, pointing straight back to the wound they were desperate to keep hidden. They tried to convince you that your memory was broken, that your perspective was flawed, that your reality couldn't be trusted. But this was never about you. It was about them. Their need to bend reality came from their terror of being seen for who they really are. Shame is an unbearable mirror for them. They can't face it, so they project it. They throw it onto you, hoping you'll carry what they cannot bear. But shame has a weight that doesn't dissolve just because you hand it off. It clings. And that's why they are constantly restless, constantly inventing new lies, constantly playing defense, even when there's no attack. They're not unpredictable. They're compulsive. Once you see that, their game loses power. You learn that gaslighting isn't about convincing you. It's about convincing themselves. Every time they tell a lie, they're trying to rewrite the script in their own head. They're trying to soothe the wound with falsehoods, because the truth would sting too much. They sell illusions not because you need them, but because they do. That's why their words always carry the same tone. Defensive, fragile, desperate. You stop taking their lies personally because you saw them for what they were, bandages on shame that never healed. Once you stop fighting their performance and start studying it, they become predictable. They are like actors who only know one role, no matter what stage they stand on. They accused you of being too sensitive, too controlling, too demanding. Every accusation was just a reflection of what they feared about themselves. That's the secret to prediction. Every attack they throw at you is actually a confession. The louder they call you untrustworthy, the more terrified they are of being exposed as liars. The more they label you difficult, the more they fear their own inability to hold relationships without manipulation. Gaslighters are mirrors turned inside out. Once you learn to read the reflections, you stop being confused by their words. You start being entertained by their predictability. Because every insult is recycled, every narrative is recycled, and every attempt to control you is another desperate cry to avoid their shame. The tragedy of the gaslighter is that they never evolve. Shame traps them in cycles they can't escape. You outgrow them because you learn, you adapt, you confront. They stay the same because their entire existence is built on avoiding confrontation with themselves. You predicted their moves not because you're gifted, but because they're lazy. It takes no creativity to gaslight. It's the same playbook every time. Denny, deflect, project, repeat. You mastered their rhythm because you stopped listening to the words and started watching the wound. Their shame was the heartbeat of every choice. That's why, even when they thought they were unpredictable, you already knew their next line. They fear exposure more than anything. That's why gaslighting is their weapon of choice. It buys them time. They think if they can twist your mind, they can delay the inevitable moment where truth surfaces. But inevitability is stronger than illusion. No matter how many stories they craft, no matter how many minds they try to bend, reality always cracks through. And when it does, the shame they've been running from is amplified. Because now it's not just in their head, it's in the open. You didn't need to destroy them. Their lies did the work for you. You only had to wait. You stopped needing their apology because you realized apologies would never come. Apologies require courage, and courage cannot grow in soil poisoned by shame. Instead, you started giving yourself the closure they could never provide. That was the true power shift. They wanted to keep you stuck doubting, waiting for validation that would never come. You chose to validate yourself, and in doing so, you broke the cycle. They cannot gaslight someone who has stopped looking to them for truth. That is the moment the predator becomes powerless. The psychology of a gaslighter is simple once you strip away the fog. They were wounded long before you met them. That wound became their identity. Instead of healing, they armored themselves with lies. But armor built on denial eventually rusts. And when it rusts, the shame seeps through. They can hide for years, but eventually, the cracks show. You played the long game. You watched. You endured. And when the cracks widened, you didn't need to do anything but step aside and let the truth speak. Predicting them wasn't a skill. It was patience. They believed they were manipulating you. In reality, you were studying them. Every twist of their words, every fake apology, every moment they tried to flip the script only confirmed what you already knew. They thought their lies were walls. To you, they were windows. You saw right through them. You saw the child inside them, terrified of being unmasked. And while they thought they were fooling you, they were actually exposing themselves, again and again, until their predictability became almost boring. They told you something was impossible because they needed you to believe it. That word, impossible, was their strongest shield. It was designed to keep you still, to discourage you from even trying. Yet impossible was never truth. It was only a story repeated enough times to feel real. You understood something they didn't want you to see. Deception is fragile. Lies require constant maintenance. Illusions need energy to survive. The moment you stop feeding them belief, they collapse under their own weight. That is why the impossible becomes inevitable. The moment you strip away the performance, you see the bones underneath. And bones always break when struck with enough precision. They wrapped their deceptions in layers of complexity, hoping you would get lost in the fog. But deception is never as strong as it looks. It relies on confusion, on overwhelming you so you don't ask the right questions. You played it differently. You didn't chase every detail, every distraction. You let the fog hang until it thinned on its own. Then you noticed the cracks, the inconsistencies, the quiet stutters in their story. Deception is fragile because it can't survive close inspection. The truth doesn't need rehearsing. Lies do. Once you know where to look, the impossible dream of exposing them becomes the inevitable outcome of patience. They told you the mountain was too high, that no one could climb it, but they never said why. They hid behind exaggeration and myth because they were afraid of being proven wrong. You decided not to argue. You started climbing. That's the power of inevitability. You move forward even when they mock you. Step by step, you strip away their lies. Each step reveals the mountain was never as tall as they claimed. Each step proves the myth was only deception dressed as truth. When you reach the top, the impossible they swore would break you becomes the inevitable result of persistence. Deception is fragile because it depends on agreement. A lie only works if you nod along. Once you withhold your agreement, the entire structure trembles. They tried to convince you that you were powerless, but that belief required your cooperation. You stopped cooperating. You stopped giving their words authority. That shift alone was enough to tilt the game in your favor. They thought power meant keeping you small. You showed them power meant refusing to kneel. And once you stood, their deception shattered like glass. They always fear the moment someone sees clearly. That is why they rush to distract, why they pile on noise, why they insist something cannot be done. But truth has a way of cutting through. When you focus, their layers peel back. When you endure, their tricks tire out. Deception cannot last forever. It breaks down under the pressure of time. That is why you kept moving, even when they called you foolish. You weren't waiting for their permission. You were waiting for their lies to collapse. And collapse they did. The so-called impossible has always been a weapon used by those who want control. They make you believe it cannot be done so you won't try. They exaggerate barriers so you'll remain still. But when you stop listening and start acting, you realize the barriers were paper walls, flimsy constructions built from fear and doubt. You walk through them, And suddenly what was impossible looks embarrassingly small. That's the lesson. They only had power because you let them define your limits. Once you reclaim that definition, inevitability takes over. They called you crazy for believing you could break through. They laughed because laughter is the last weapon of those who have no evidence. Yet every laugh was an admission. It revealed their dependence on deception. They didn't want you to succeed because your success would expose their weakness. And when you finally broke through, when you turned their impossible into your inevitable, they had nothing left to say. The silence was proof. They never believed in their own deception. They only needed you to. You see now that deception is a fragile cage. It doesn't need a key to escape. It only needs awareness. The walls don't hold you, your belief in them does. Once you stop believing, you walk out freely. That's why people who cling to lies fear you. You've already learned how weak the cage really is. You can see the cracks. You can hear the strain. And when you decide to push, the entire structure comes crashing down. The impossible is nothing more than a shadow cast by deception. They tell you it cannot be done because they are too afraid to attempt it themselves. They project their fear onto you, hoping it will bind you as it has bound them. You turned fear into fuel. You moved anyway. You endured the ridicule, the doubt, the silence. And in the end, your victory was not just over the challenge. It was over the illusion itself. You proved that the shadow has no substance once you shine a light on it. Every manipulator believes he is smarter than the room. He thinks his strings are invisible, his whispers undetectable, his traps too clever to escape. For a while it works. People fall for his charm, his carefully rehearsed stories, his selective displays of weakness meant to lure sympathy. But manipulation requires constant control, and constant control requires energy. The manipulator cannot help himself. He wants more, always more. He pushes past what is necessary, reaching too far, tightening the strings until everyone starts to feel the tension. That's when his mask begins to slip. Overreaching is his fate. That's the only prediction worth betting on. They think subtlety will last forever, but their greed betrays them. Manipulators aren't satisfied with influence. They want domination. They want to decide what you think, how you feel, what you do, and who you trust. That hunger drives them to stretch their lies wider and wider, covering more ground than they can manage. And that's when the cracks form. You don't need to rush to expose them. All you have to do is wait. Given enough time, every manipulator steps too far. He makes a demand too bold, a lie too grand, or an accusation too absurd. That is the moment the house of cards collapses. You never needed to outplay them move for move. You just needed patience. Manipulators reveal themselves because they cannot live without validation. They crave proof that their control is working. And to get that proof, they escalate. They tighten the leash. They amplify the guilt trips. They exaggerate their importance. The same tactics that fooled you at first eventually repeat so loudly that they expose the script. Suddenly, what once felt persuasive now feels desperate. They don't see it, but everyone else begins to notice. Their hunger writes their downfall. The beauty of prediction lies in knowing human nature never changes. Manipulators are trapped by their own psychology. Shame drives their need for power. Insecurity drives their need for control. And ego drives their need to keep proving it. Overreaching is inevitable because their fear of being powerless will always outweigh their sense of caution. That's why you don't need to fight them at every turn. You let them keep pulling the strings tighter until the puppet show breaks. When they overreach, they expose the very weakness they thought they had buried. In relationships, the manipulator pretends to be the savior, the lover, the loyal friend. But over time, the act requires too much maintenance. Their need to control deepens, and they begin to demand more of you than they deserve. They overreach by twisting your reality too far, by trying to erase parts of you they cannot dominate. And that's when their cover breaks. You see the desperation behind the mask, the trembling hand behind the forced calm. That's when you realize they were never strong. They were terrified. And the overreach was proof. In power struggles, manipulators love to orchestrate conflict. They pit people against each other. hoping to stand above the wreckage as the quiet puppeteer. But when their hunger grows, they overplay their hand. They make themselves too central to the story. They become obvious. And once they are obvious, their power evaporates. No one trusts the man who reaches too far. No one follows the voice that screams for control. Exposure is not an accident. It is the destiny of every manipulator who cannot stop himself from stretching one lie into 10. You learn not to waste your energy fighting their illusions. Fighting a manipulator head-on only feeds his game. Instead, you allowed him to keep building, keep twisting, keep reaching. You waited for the overreach, because that moment is the only proof you ever need. It arrives like clockwork. It arrives without fail. It arrives because manipulators cannot resist proving themselves. The irony is sharp. They reveal what you could never have exposed yourself. They pull off their own mask. The collapse is always poetic. The manipulator who wanted control ends up exposed by the very lies he crafted. His reach exceeds his grasp, and suddenly everyone sees the truth. His tricks look desperate. His words lose power. His influence dissolves. You don't have to shout. You don't have to fight. You simply watch as he burns himself down. That is the secret. Manipulators are not defeated by others. They are defeated by their own compulsions. They will never understand that restraint is the only way to maintain control. And because they cannot restrain themselves, their ending is always predictable. They will always go too far. They will always try to take more than the situation allows. They will always expose their own hand. This is why patience is your greatest weapon. You don't need to match their lies with truth. You don't need to fight their games with games of your own. You wait, and the overreach destroys them. Every manipulator eventually reveals himself by overreaching. That is the only prediction worth betting on. You don't need to see the future to know it. All you need is clarity, endurance, and the discipline to let time do the work. They think they are invincible in their deception. You know deception is fragile. You know hunger always betrays itself. And you know the longer they play, the sooner they fall. They fear the light because the light would make them transparent. Exposure is their greatest terror. Not rejection, not failure, not even losing you. It is the thought of being seen for what they really are. That is why gaslighting becomes their favorite weapon. If they can make you doubt your memory, your intuition, your perception, then the spotlight never turns back on them. They twist your words, erase your experiences, deny the obvious, because truth is lethal to them. Truth is the one mirror they cannot afford to stand in front of. You understood this. That's why you stopped begging them to admit it. They will never admit what they are hiding, because the exposure would feel like death. Gaslighting is not about cleverness. It is about desperation. They need to rewrite reality before reality unmasks them. That is why their stories always shift, why their apologies are laced with excuses, why they insist you are too sensitive, too dramatic, too suspicious. They are not defending against you. They are defending against the truth leaking out of them. And the more fragile they feel, the harder they push. You noticed it. The louder their denials, the closer you were to the truth. That's the pattern. Their intensity reveals their fear. They don't lie to gain power. They lie to keep from collapsing under shame. Exposure would strip them bare. So they convince themselves that if they can make you feel crazy, if they can make you question your own eyes, they can hide a little longer. But that's the fragile irony. Gaslighting always exposes the gaslighter eventually. Because the harder they fight to keep the truth buried, the more obvious it becomes that they are hiding something. You don't need to chase them. You just need to watch. Time does the exposing for you. They want to paint you as the unstable one. That is their shield. If they can make others see you as erratic, then any truth you reveal can be dismissed. That's why their lies are crafted carefully, dripping with fake concern. They say things like, "I worry about your memory," or "You seem stressed," not because they care, but because they are preparing their defense. They want the world to believe that if exposure comes, it's not real. It's just your imagination. You saw through it. You recognized that fake softness for what it was, fear disguised as kindness. The truth is gaslighting is a confession. Every time they deny the obvious, they confess that the obvious is real. Every time they tell you you're imagining things, they confess they cannot face what they did. Every time they twist your words, they confess their own weakness. You started to see gaslighting not as power, but as panic. Once you understood that they stopped being intimidating, they became predictable. Their denial stopped hurting you.